And here's something I like very much and found in Lewis Mumford's book, The Transformations of Man. We have arrived at a truism that has so far been forgotten it has the air of a paradox. The need to become human is man's first need, and perhaps it remains his deepest one. Nature provides the materials for this change, but man himself must effect it. In essence, it rests on a constant effort at self-identification, self-affirmation, self-discipline, and self-development. By becoming human, man exchanges the stable natural self native to each biological species for a countless multitude of possible selves, molded for the working out of a special drama and plot that he himself helps to create. In order to effect an ongoing, self-renewing change, we need maintain a constant effort at self-identification, self-affirmation, self-discipline, and self-development. And here's something from the writings of Martin Buber that I found to be one of the most powerful and moving things I've ever read. Man wishes to be confirmed in his being by man, and wishes to have a presence in the being of another. Secretly and bashfully, he watches for a yes, which allows him to be, and which can come to him only from one human person to another. We notice this most with our dealings with children, but it also holds true with every person with whom we have any sort of real contact. We need to be confirmed in our being by others. We wish and need to have a presence in the being of another, and secretly and bashfully we watch for a yes, which allows us to be, and which can come to us only from one human person to another. I thought that was beautiful. Everyone will agree, or at least give lip service to the concept that he'd like to be a completely free and autonomous person. But we learn from an excellent book by Walter Kaufman entitled Without Guilt and Justice that humanity craves but dreads autonomy. One does not want to live under the yoke of guilt and fear. Autonomy consists of making with open eyes the decisions that give shape to one's life. But being afraid of making fateful decisions, one is tempted to hide autonomy in a metaphysical fog and to become sidetracked and bogged down in puzzles about free will and determinism. It's far easier to define autonomy out of existence than it is to achieve autonomy in the very meaningful sense in which it can be attained. The difference between making the decisions that govern our lives with our eyes open and somehow avoiding this is all important. The best way to begin to understand autonomy is to examine some of the major strategies people use to avoid it. And this I shall do, he writes, and he does brilliantly. In this book, Kaufman examines 10 strategies by which people avoid making the kind of fateful and meaningful decisions about their lives that could transform them into courageous and autonomous persons. He calls those who avoid making such decisions decision, and the condition of avoiding decisions, phobia. He points out that people do not fear all decisions, for immersion in microscopic decisions is one good way of avoiding fateful decisions. Before getting into the 10 strategies people use to avoid making decisions, he points out that it's easy to understand why parents cultivate the fear of falling in their children. Precipitous heights are dangerous, and having been taught to dread them, one communicates one's dread to one's children. That's much easier than teaching them prudence, self-reliance, and the skills required to enjoy peace. All this applies just as much to decidophobia. Anyone making fateful decisions that affect others without feeling any apprehension would be a menace. Anyone who would unhesitatingly plunge into choices that are likely to mold his own character and future would be so unpredictable that he too would endanger the social fabric. The easiest way to ensure stability is to engender fear. Teaching the skills required for responsible decision-making is much harder. Choosing responsibly means that one weighs alternatives. He develops this theme further in his chapter on the new integrity. But comparing fateful alternatives and choosing between them with one's eyes open, fully aware of the risk, is what frightens the decidophobe. Now, basically, he has 3 options: to avoid fateful decision, to stack the card so that one alternative is clearly the right one and there seems to be no risk involved at all, and to decline responsibility. He need not even choose between these options. They can be combined. In brief, avoid if possible. If that does not work, stack. And in any case, make sure that you do not stand alone. It would be reasonable to feel apprehension in direct proportion to the number of those whom our decision is likely to affect importantly. But people tend to attach disproportionate importance to themselves. The decisions they dread most are those that shape their character and their future. He goes on to write, I shall examine 10 strategies that help decidophobe to avoid dizziness. All of them involve the refusal to scrutinize significant alternatives. When anyone shuts his eyes in a crisis, it is plausible to assume that he's afraid. But if he merely acts as if he were afraid, he's still open to criticism. My critique of phobia applies also to those who are not afraid, but merely behave as if they were. And he goes on to write, before I consider the 10 strategies, let me comment very briefly on 2 writers who have illuminated decidophobia and one who has not. He then goes into a discussion of Kierkegaard, the father of existentialism, and Jean-Paul Sartre, and mentions Sartre's famous declaration in 1943 that man is condemned to be free, suggesting clearly that man finds freedom hard to bear. He points out that in Sartre's philosophy, man is freedom, but always tends to look upon himself as if he were a thing. Thus he succumbs to what Sartre called mauvaise foi. In my language, this bad faith and these constant self-deceptions are prompted by decidophobia. And after commenting on Eric Fromm's book, Escape from Freedom, and the example of how Hitler achieved complete control of Germany's fate, he examines the 10 strategies most common to decidophobia. In first place, he lists religion, and points out that, as a rule, one does not even decide to submit to the authority of a religion. One is born into the fold and then confirmed at the threshold of adolescence before one has any chance to explore alternatives and make a choice. One does not so much decide to stay as one does not decide to leave. Keeps one in the fold. Admitting quite readily that not all religious people are devoted, he says that nevertheless religion represents one of the most popular strategies for avoiding the most fateful decisions. In fact, it's nothing less than a classical strategy. Number 2 he lists as drifting. It represents another, even less deliberate strategy, and it comes in 2 forms. Model A is extremely popular with those over 30, without being confined to them. Status quo is, instead of choosing how to live, with whom, where, what to do, and what to believe, one simply drifts along in the status quo. All decisions are made, none need to be made. Some people need a regular supply of alcohol or tranquilizers to remain satisfied with Model A. This form of inauthenticity is readily perceived by many students, and a few go to the opposite extreme, which is Model B. One drops out, has no ties, and is not guided by tradition. One has no code, no plan, no major purpose. One lives from moment to moment, rarely knowing in advance what one will do next. Model B can also be lubricated with alcohol, but since World War II, this kind of drifting has been associated more often with other drugs. Some of those who have drifted in a Model B are afraid of making almost any decision. If they hitchhike, they go wherever they're taken. They leave things to chance. Everything depends on whatever impulse happens to be felt at the moment. To be governed by caprice is the drift. The hero of Camus' novel The Stranger illustrates this orientation. When this way of life breeds a sense of emptiness and despair, one becomes receptive to the siren song of commitment. Allegiance to a movement is the 3rd strategy. Such allegiance, again, is not always decidophobic. Some movements have little bearing on faith and morals, goals, and lifestyle. If so, membership is marginal, although it may still be prompted by a fear of standing alone and some sense that there is safety in numbers. Total immersion, in which no crucial decisions at all remain to be made, is the exception, not the rule. Allegiance to a school of thought comes next, followed by exegetical thinking. Walter Kaufmann points out that exegetical thinking assumes that the text that one interprets is right. Thus, the text is treated as an authority. If what it seems to say is wrong, the exegesis must be inadequate. The interpreter is wrong, never the text. Incidentally, I'm just hitting the high spots. He goes into a complete description and evaluation of each strategy as he lists it. The 6th strategy is Manichaeism. The Manichaean insists on the need for a decision, but the choice is loaded and practically makes it so. It's like being asked to choose between 2 dishes of food and being told that this one is poisoned and will make you sick, while that one tastes incomparably better and will improve your health and expand your consciousness. All good is on one side, all evil on the other. Inconvenient facts are ignored or denied. The falsification of history becomes an indispensable cut, and uncomfortable arguments are discredited as coming from the forces of evil. There's no need for quandaries that keep men sleepless, and he points out that it's easier to ridicule this strategy than to resist it. The 7th strategy is much the subtlest of the lot, and Kaufmann calls it moral ritualism. It claims that purely rational procedures can show what one ought to do or what would constitute a just society. There is then no need at all to choose between different ideals, different societies, different goals. Once again, no room is left for tragic quandaries or fateful choices. He then writes, I have considered 7 ways of avoiding autonomy. 1. Religion. 2. Drifting. 3. Allegiance to a movement. 4. Allegiance to a school of thought. 5. Exegetical thinking. 6. Nihilism. And 7. Moral rationalism. It is possible to systematize these 7 strategies under 2 headings. First, avoiding fateful decisions, methods 1 to 5, and second, making fateful decisions but stacking the cards in some way so that the choice will make it so, and there's no possibility of tragedy. Choices 6 and 7. The 8th strategy for avoiding autonomy is pedantry. It plays a central part in the creeping microscopism mentioned earlier, and I've noted previously, he writes, that as long as one remains absorbed in microscopic distinctions, one is in no great danger of coming face to face with fateful decision. Of course, careful attention to detail is not only compatible with autonomy, but a requirement of intellectual integrity. Pedantry becomes diatopic at the point where a person never gets around to considering major decisions with any care, and closes his eyes to microscopic alternatives, and the same criteria apply to all the other strategies. The 9th strategy is the faith that one is riding the wave of the future. This, too, is usually part of a mixed strategy and frequently associated with religion, allegiance to a movement, belonging to a school of thought, or Manichaeism. Those who employ the 9th strategy never stand alone or unsupported. They always feel backed up by force majeure, astrology, oracle, and the Chinese Jing, which achieved such immense popularity in the United States during the 1960s, have always attracted this xenophobe. And the 10th and final strategy is married. The 10th strategy, finally, often spells total relief, like the first 2. At first glance, it looks quite different from the others and therefore out of place, but it's probably the most popular strategy of all. When getting married, legions of women have echoed Ruth's beautiful words, which in the Bible are not spoken to a husband. Your people shall be my people, your God my God. Henceforth, they agree to make no more fateful decisions. They will leave that to their husband. This pattern is deeply ingrained in many cultures. It's what a woman is expected to do when she gets married, and she's expected to get married. Actually, it doesn't always work that way. The man who boasts of making all the big decisions while he leaves the small ones to his wife may admit, when asked to explain, that big decisions concern what we should do about climate. Small decisions deal with such matters as buying a house and where to live. Figuratively speaking, many men marry their mothers. It would be wrong to suppose either that marriage must involve decidophobia, or that when it does, only one spouse can have succumbed. This strategy can work for both husband and wife. Often a couple is a committee of 2 and makes decisions the way committees usually do. A consensus is presumed and not questioned if all goes well. But if things turn out badly, one does not feel altogether responsible. One merely went along. Left to one's own devices, one might have acted quite differently. In a bad marriage, such excuses are stated expressly. In a so-called good marriage, they're entertained privately. However unworthy it may be to harbor such thoughts, there's much more than a grain of truth in them. Left to their own devices, both partners, or on a committee, most or even all members might indeed have made a different decision. As it happened, nobody made any decision at all. And that was one of the main features of the whole arrangement from the start. Marriage is a way of avoiding the necessity of having to make fateful decisions. Instead of making a decision, one talks until something transpires. Another way of putting this point is less nasty and is unassailably true. In marriage, one no longer stands alone. Both partners have somebody to lean on if all goes well. It does require a fateful decision to get married in the first place, but that decision may have been prompted by decidophobia, by the desire to escape loneliness, by an unwillingness to make decisions in solitude. And there's nothing paradoxical in that. Gar's famous leap into commitment is quite typically the plunge one takes from a solitary height to be rid of freedom. It would require a fateful decision to go to a surgeon and say, please, doctor, give me a frontal lobotomy. But it would not be in the least paradoxical to say that anyone who made that choice was a decidophobe who had come to the conclusion that he could not take it anymore. Now, believe it or not, the part of the book that I've reviewed here constitutes only a part of the first 30 pages, and it's from here on out that the brilliance of Walter Kaufman Shows us how and why we tend to sidestep autonomy, why we tend to tiptoe through life as though we're trying to make it safely to death. I believe every person who has any intention whatsoever of leading anything approaching a life of autonomy and freedom could read and reread this book. I agree wholeheartedly with Professor John D. Dessinger, who said of this book that it proposes a new and liberating human ethic, that of creative autonomy. The author's argument is intellectually incandescent and logically compelling. The book is bound to become a major landmark in modern philosophy. By all means, read Without Guilt and Justice, From Decidophobia to Autonomy by Walter Kaufman, and add it to the important section of your library. He goes on to describe the autonomous person and lists actual persons whom he thinks have earned that rare and wonderful state. The bibliography at the back of the book will introduce you, as it did me, to many other books you want to add to your collection. Success as a human being, and in our work in life, always seems to hinge on the making of big and fateful decisions. How often have you heard someone say, "If only I had done so-and-so when I had the opportunity," or after having finally made a major decision, say, "I could have done this 20 years ago." In Dr. Pearl's book on gestalt therapy, he recalls that when an opportunity came along for a psychotherapist to take an opening in South Africa, several good men in Germany turned it down. He took it and became quite wealthy and famous as a result, while those who had refused the post ended up in Hitler's death camp. This is not to say that we need to jump at every opportunity that beckons, or that we're going to be killed if we don't, but there's a little doubt that we might take a much more adventurous attitude toward life and growth and look with great care on such opportunities when they present themselves. And this excellent book helps us examine ourselves and decide which, if any of his 10 strategies, have been keeping us in the shallows when we might have sailed into deeper and more interesting seas.